resume is full of lies and mistruths. It is completely fraudulent. Any similarities to places or people, living or dead, well, that sure is something, isn't it? Before we start, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time out to meet with us. Are you kidding? I've been looking forward to this interview. I should let you know, we here at put a lot of weight into our prospective employees' past work experience. Since this job entails a myriad of expertise and abilities, we like to get a more complete picture of your employment history. Yes, very understandable. Understandable. Stunner. Got it. Yes. So let's take a look. It says here that out of high school you worked as a service bureau technician at... Ah, yes. Someone at work told me that was my title, but I think he made it up just to sound important. Service bureau technician does sound rather vague. What did you do there? Well, the service we provided was mainly for graphic art firms all over town. They would bring their materials to us to get it print ready. Print ready? Ready to go to the printers. It was just the time the computers were taking over. But before computers, if you wanted to get something enlarged or reduced, it would have to be done by a photographic process with something called a stat machine. Essentially a large camera, with half of it inside a darkroom and the other half out. You would put the artwork on a big rotating table, lock it down, and then crank a bunch of wheels back and forth like you were in a submarine. This would move the table closer or further from the lens. Then, inside the darkroom, you would open up the other side of the camera. It was like an oven door, but the door had a vacuum in it. You would slap down the photo paper on the door, flip the switch for the vacuum, close the door, and then set your exposure. Halftones required 3 separate exposures. Wait, halftones? The grayscale-looking images that you would find in newspapers that weren't actually gray, but made up of different-sized black and white dots. There was actually quite an art to shooting halftones. I see. Well, moving on. Why don't you tell me about this job as a personal assistant for... How did you get that job? Well, to answer that, I have to tell you about my previous job. The more information, the better. Alright then. I had just moved to LA and got a job at a cafe in Santa Monica, just bordering the north side of Venice Beach. It was a bakery as well that sold gluten-free, soy-made, never-touched-a-peanut, special dietary kinds of goods. 2 weeks after I started, the place was bought out by this real intense Korean businessman. For the first month that he bought it, he didn't talk to any of us working there. He just walked around quietly, watching. When that month was over, the yelling started. He would scream at us, telling us that we must dress good, make sure we organized display, and above all, move product. That was the biggest one. Move product. Move product. He owned 6 cafes in ritzy parts of LA. He actually wanted me to move the old stale product to another all-night cafe he owned in Venice when I got off of work, but I refused. I worked with some interesting people there. There was one guy in particular I worked the night shifts with. I was giving him a ride home one night, and offhand I said, "Another day, another dollar." He shot an intense look at me and asked, "You been in prison?" "No," I replied. "Oh," he said, "we always used to say that in prison." The guy looked like a kid that might take your lunch money, but I have to say, he was the most honest, trustworthy, and down-to-earth person that I met in that crazy city. Anyway, the job was awful. We were treated like trash, and after a few ridiculous incidences, I had to leave. But I had no job waiting for me, and no prospects either. After I quit, I was sitting on the couch in my underwear, drinking a beer, watching hockey, and feeling sorry for myself, when I got a call from a regular from the cafe. She heard I had quit, got my number, and was looking for a personal assistant. Someone who could help her organize her life that had been uprooted due to a messy divorce. We worked out of her one-bedroom apartment. The office was a disaster. Files, bills, receipts, letters, and little scraps of paper with notes written on them were strewn everywhere. I could barely understand anything the woman said. She was a crazy person, to put it bluntly. She actually had been diagnosed with OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, along with a whole list of other conditions. She would start a sentence with a thought, but along the way another thought would come up, and she would start in without finishing her first point, and it would go on and on like this, with the pace of a hummingbird with crack cocaine in its bird feeder. A typical sentence would go like this. "The most important thing we have to do today is not just today, but over the next few... I want to be done in a month with this particular... A month and a half at the latest, because we also will be watering the plants once the weather, so you have to go down to the Home Depot, and I have a list for the file cabinets, because that is the most important. I didn't ask you if you could type. This job entails a lot of typing. Watering is, well, a smarter man would have run. But at the time, I was in a cycle of putting myself in horrible situations. The job consisted mostly of filing, organizing, running strange errands, cleaning, and writing letter upon letter threatening to sue people. Wait a second. I'm sorry. Did you say cleaning? I most certainly did. So you cleaned the apartment of a woman with OCD. How did you... Diligently, sir. Diligently. With a good measure of patience. Once we got the filing under control, if you could call it that, we started in on the to-do list. After a week or so of compiling the list, the subsequent days were structured like this. The first few hours were spent adding to the list, then 4 hours or so were devoted to doing 1 or 2 things from the list, and the final 2 hours of the day were spent updating and revising the list. But to call it a list would be disingenuous. It was less of a list and more of a tome. Each line was a thing to do, such as call Standish about malpractice suit, or get brown spots off kitchen floor. The list was typed on a computer, single-spaced, and 33 pages long. I worked for her for 5.5 months, all the way up until I moved from LA. My girlfriend's friend needed a job, so I set her up with this woman. The young lady lasted a day and a half until she broke down in tears and quit, exclaiming to the woman that she was bat-honking loco. My goodness, you might say. Moving on, I see that event production experience fills out quite a bit of your resume. Indeed. Would you care to elaborate on those areas of your employment history? It started with a small company in the foothills. A friend ran the company with another man who happened to be a bit crazy. I've since realized this trend of crazy employers and have done my best to break that chain. The job consisted of what the English would call casual labor, but mostly it was loading and unloading trucks, a skill I acquired as a youth, as my mother was in the business of going to antique shows to sell her merchandise. At 7, I was the only one I knew my age that knew how to pack a truck. I used to joke that my parents really didn't want kids, they just wanted cheap labor. Anyway, at the event company, we did mostly window displays and some small corporate events, making party props and that sort of thing. Business started ramping up just when I left. The last party we did was turning an airplane hangar into a fancy party venue. When I moved to Chicago, I looked up the premier event company in town and applied. Since I had the experience, they hired me on the spot. Little did I know that the place was less of an event company and more of a bar mitzvah factory. That was 99.9% of their business. And it wasn't cheap either. People would spend 10 to 40 grand on the decorations alone to bring their 13-year-old boys into manhood, or girls into womanhood in the case of a bat mitzvah. When I graduated high school, I went to a friend's house whose parents gave them a beautiful set of matching luggage for getting their degree. I jokingly quipped, "What are they trying to tell you, huh?" Everyone had a good chuckle. Then I went home to open my gift, which was a sleeping bag and a walking stick. So you can see where these bar mitzvahs were a bit of culture shock for me. I had 8 or so bosses over me, and they were always coming back to us in the art department to tell us different things. Well, not to tell us, but more accurately, to yell and scream at us. The berating was so over the top, it was actually comical. "What the do you think you're doing?" a boss would yell. "Who told you to paint that star this color, you Gus did," I would reply. "Oh, well, make sure you